G'day guys, and today I have a rather special video for you all. In this video I'm going to be recounting my experience taking on Passionflower Incarnata as a mind-altering substance, as I did a few days ago. I've always been fascinated with mind-altering substances, especially psychedelics, and recently my curiosity has arisen once again. I've just been reading a few interesting books on the subjects. I've read Tal Warwick's, or Sticks, Hexenhammer's, Psychedelic Spirituality, I should say, and I'm currently just finishing off The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. And so, obviously based on these books, based on the value that these people seem to derive from entheogens, mind-altering substances, I of course wanted to partake in this and obviously see what value I could gain from that sort of thing. So what I wanted to do, being sort of a younger man and having my brain still developing, I just wanted to take it slow and sort of tackle something very soft to start with and see if it honestly if it freaked me out, because Passionflower Incarnata is classified as a mild hallucinogen. You can see things on it, and I thought, if I'm going to see things and they're going to scare me quite a bit, or if this is just really not the thing for me, I'd rather do it with a more tame substance than with something quite hard like DMT, psilocybin, or LSD. The hope is that I will build up to those substances in the future, but for now I just have this more mild substance. Now, I'm not a complete stranger to mind-altering substances. A few years ago I tried cannabis about, I think, 24 times. So it's interesting to compare that with this, so to speak. So like Aldous Huxley, in that spring morning of 1953, I took my substance and sat down and waited to see what would happen. And the first thing I noticed was a sort of embellishment of my thought process. It's the specific words I was using. For example, I was about halfway through my tea. I brewed this flower extract into tea, and instead of thinking to myself, oh, I'm going to drink the rest of that tea, I thought to myself, I'm going to imbibe the rest of that tea. Now, imbibe is just a more decorative way of saying to drink, but it was interesting to see that the first change that came on within 10 minutes, I would say, was a sort of adornment of my language. It became, I won't say romanticized, but it was just interesting to see, because the entire sentence structure didn't change, you see. It was just a single word. Often the verbs would change to a more adorned version, which was interesting to see. It definitely affected the way I began to think. The next thing that came about is I refused to speak above a whisper. I was, of course, talking to myself, describing the scene to myself, sort of testing out this new verbs and things I was using, and just seeing, how I would describe things sort of as a test. Usually I would look at something and say, oh, that's just the couch or whatever, but now I was looking at it in a different light, and I wanted to see if that presented itself in my language. So yes, I refused to speak above a whisper, which may not be a universal thing. That is something I also tended to do on cannabis. Maybe just because my sort of auditory feed in was a bit, screwed up, and a whisper sounded totally loud enough and normal for me. So I wouldn't count that as a general effect of Passionflower. So at this next point, I sat down on the couch and just allowed myself to sort of relax, sit in with the experience, and allow what was to happen to happen. I was before, taking breaks to write down notes, but I thought, let's just see what can happen, not affect it in that regard. And what happened is, as I was sitting on the couch looking across at this wall that I see every day, I walk past it all the time, as I come and go through the house, and the wall took on a different aspect. Now, it didn't appear any different in the sort of, the colors didn't change, there was no warbling, there was nothing like that, no hallucinogenic content to this wall, but its sort of position in space seemed very different. So I'm not sure if there's any spatial distortion that comes with hypnotic substances like the Passionflower, but it's very interesting. I was looking at this wall and I was sort of almost seeing it for the first time, and I was looking at all the little things that were all over it, and I'd never noticed that and that sort of thing, and that was very pleasing to me to sort of look upon something with a fresh pair of eyes. My attention became very singularly focused on certain things. I remember staring at there's a 5-litre bottle of coolant for my car that's just sitting on a table in the room, and I was staring at it because I was like, why is that bottle of coolant still there? I fixed my car ages ago, and I just walk past this thing every day, and it's just sitting there. And then I was having a look at these worm catchers, and they were just sitting there, and I was trying to I walk past those things every day. And then it got more interesting when I was wrapped up in a blanket, I should say, but I sort of recalled that I actually had a physical presence in the room. I had a physical body and that sort of thing. And I uncovered my foot and I began to look at my foot for a very long time, just looking at my foot and flexing my toes and seeing the way the light played across them, which was thoroughly, I won't say entertaining, but enrapturing. I must have been there for about a quarter of an hour just watching my foot flex, which was very interesting. I was indeed hypnotized by my own foot, which is a very ridiculous state of affairs. I was very calm, very relaxed, had no need to suddenly move or anything like that. I was very content just to be very, very still and just stare out into the world. The only movements I made was to occasionally, move my head to stare at something else. But it was very interesting to me, the sort of reaction to my own body, the reaction to my own flesh that occurred, because I'm not sure if it's the right word, but I was somewhat repulsed by it. I was sitting there wrapped up in this blanket for so long, I kind of forgot about it a bit as I was, hypnotized by other things, as I mentioned. And then I suddenly recalled that I had a physical presence, a body, as I mentioned, and this was very intriguing to me. Now, normally when we wake up in the morning or, we do anything throughout the day, we don't really consider the fact that we have a body in this regard, and we don't sort of consider its form and substance. You've got things like bodybuilding and things like that, but this isn't the same. My body seemed very crude. I remember looking at it and instantly thinking of something I read online, that the human body is essentially just an organic spacesuit that allows you to survive in the Earth's atmosphere. And what really is important, what really is you, in the strictest sense, I mean, your body is yours, but if you really think about it, all the sort of stuff that makes you you, in your personality and your consciousness, really occurs in your brain and your spinal cord. So I thought that was very interesting. I was looking at my own body, but I was somewhat disassociated from it. I didn't have an out-of-body experience, but I felt detached from it. This wasn't something that I was incredibly close to and adored very much. This was like something that was just necessary, like a tool. Like, when I'm at work, I don't have any particular adoration and love for my, my spanners, my drills and that sort of thing. It's just a tool that I use to get the job done. And now when I'm looking at my own body, when I'm recording this, I appreciate my body. It's a great thing. I love it and I take care of it. But when I was under the influence of this hypnotic, that just simply wasn't there anymore. And it was this utility item that I felt very detached from. Now, if you've done some reading into psychedelics and stuff, you may hear this reference to the ego death or the destruction of self, where people feel so ultimately detached from themselves, it's like they don't even exist anymore and they sort of float around just as a consciousness. That's where you get the sort of out-of-body experience stuff. And I'd be very interested to see if this sort of detachment and the viewing of the body as a utility item rather than as something that is cherished and very dear to you is the beginning of that sort of thing. Again, I didn't see anything hallucinogenic when I took this substance, but perhaps I began to start the process of the ego death in this very, very minor capacity. This train of thought progressed along as I stood up from the living room and went into the bathroom. I was sort of detached from my body. I kind of watched it stand up on its own almost. I'd been sitting there and thinking for a while, I can move really fast if I wanted to. I can remember, playing footy and running really fast and being agile like that. But at that moment I had literally no desire to be sort of active in that capacity. I just wanted to sit there. But eventually I did stand up, but it was almost like watching someone else do it. I was running on automatic, that sort of thing. And it was very interesting to me, whenever I've been sort of, for want of a better word, imbibed with a substance that provokes an alternative state of mind, fucked off my face in other words, I've always been very preoccupied with symbolism and labels and that sort of thing. So what would essentially happen a lot when I was on cannabis is I'd be looking at something, say it's a group of friends or something, and this is going to sound quite strange, but unfortunately I lacked the sort of oratory skills to convey what I was feeling at the time. But it was almost as if I was looking at a painting or a scene, and I would attempt to attribute some sort of label or symbol to that scene. Now, often this was, humorous, as cannabis often is, and I was joking about whatever, and we'd laugh in hysterics as I attempted to describe what I was seeing, and it was always humorous in some manner. But I bring this up because what essentially happened is when I thought of my body as the whole, when I went beyond just the foot, because I was just staring at that for a little bit, again, very strange state of affairs, I went into the bathroom and I took my shirt off and I had a look at sort of my torso and upper body as far as I could see it. And what I named it the grotesquerie. Now that's a made up word from a book series, a sort of teenage book series, and the grotesquerie is this enormous muscled monster made up of many different parts of other monsters. It's got this stinger. It has an arm that can unravel into many tendons. It's a disgusting and hugely muscled creature, and sort of like a dumb brute. And this is very interesting to me, because why would I describe, again, my body, which is, of course, we all like our bodies. It's the most important piece of property we own. We can't enjoy anything else without our bodies, so therefore, most important piece of property. Why would I look upon myself and be so sort of callous in my labeling of my most important piece of property, referring to it as the grotesquerie? Perhaps it was just a reference, a sort of joining of the dots, because I'm quite a fit person, and so I'm quite well muscled, and the grotesquerie is a character, you look up what it looks like, and it is quite muscled itself, and maybe I was just, linking the dots and saying, hey, I sort of look like this thing. But perhaps, and I would sort of lean towards this, it was a bit deeper than that. So I'm not 100% sure why I thought that I was comparable to this patchwork monster. So that's sort of the unsolved mystery of the day, so to speak. Something else that was very interesting was when I sort of looked upon my reflection, and I began to talk to my own reflection, and I brought up something that I'd actually thought of a couple years ago whilst on cannabis again. I'll attempt to recount this little story right now. So what essentially happened is I was high on cannabis, and I was at a train station, and I saw my shadowed reflection in the window of a passing train as it sort of flew past. And I sort of came to the conclusion, and I remarked that being regarded as a shadow or a pale imitation was highly insulting, as the shadow has no summoned substance of its own and is merely the product of someone or something else. So to refer to someone is to deny them their animus. You recognize them as only a byproduct of something else, and it denies them their capacity for sort of depth, nuance, and tone, etc. If we literally think what a shadow is, it's just like a flat monotextured outline. It's just a silhouette. There's no depth to that. There's no tone. It's a bit grey there. It's a bit white there. It's just this one flat 2D thing. So whilst in the bathroom, I was taken along by this train of thought of the shadow. I recalled this event, and I began to think about what it meant to be a reflection. And of course, if we follow this same train of thinking, this is also a highly insulting term, because you don't have any animus. You're just the byproduct of someone else. They move their arm, you move your arm. It's like you almost have no free will. So again, I considered it insulting to be called either a shadow or a reflection. And I asked my reflection, I put my hand up into the mirror and touched it like every scene in the movie ever, and asked myself, am I the person out here, or I am the man in there? So it was an interesting bit of self-reflection. I asked myself, am I just a reflection, a follower? Do I have my own animus, my own sort of, I wouldn't say free will, I was more questioning myself in regards to conformity. Do I just follow people, or do I sort of have my own animating spirit and decide what I want to do, independent of the actions of others? Now that may sound just, a little bit confronting, but this is exactly the sort of thing that I wanted to do when I set out on this little quest. I wanted to expand my doors of perception, change the way I saw reality and the way I was thinking, and vice versa, as one influenced the other. And I wanted to sort of provoke different thoughts and see where they led me. So I'm very glad that in this altered state of mind, I was able to still retain, a degree of humbleness, and was able to question myself, rather than we think of a lot of drug users as just hedonists. They're out there just for the feeling in itself. But I was pleased with my ability to, not get completely sucked in and just stare at my foot in a meaningless manner. It eventually translated into a bit of self-knowledge, a bit of self-growth, a bit of questioning, which is very important. We must always reflect on our actions and think about them. If we just keep doing stuff and doing stuff and doing stuff, we're not very different to animals. If we just, act on instinct, it is the mark of the human condition to be, thinking about your own thoughts. You partake in a certain action, you make a certain choice, and later on you reflect on that. Was this the most efficient choice? Was this the best choice? Was this the most moral choice? And that sort of thing. And to go a little bit further, this is the purpose of guilt. You think to yourself, why do I constantly remember and just cringe at that horrible thing that I did during 5th grade or whatever? It was so long ago, it doesn't have any relevance to me now. Well, the purpose of retaining that memory, is to make sure that you don't do that negative action in the future. So again, I have to ask myself, rather brutally, and say, was the fact that I was concerned with the idea of whether I was a reflection or not why did that come to the fore? Is that something that I'm actually worried about? Is it true? Am I just a reflection, or am I my own sort of animating person with my own sort of personality, so to speak? This is something that's quite important to me. I value my integrity very highly. I don't like people who are sort of conformists, who change the way they act based on the situation. I understand that just happens a little bit. So for example, you've got your rugby mates and then your classmates at school. You're going to talk about different stuff, so your mannerisms are going to be different. But it's people who sort of completely flip-flop and who hold certain beliefs with one group but refuse to express them in another, and that sort of thing. It's like with these people, there's just this arbitrary little thing, and then they'll completely flip on everything. And that means they can completely flip on you. It does seem like a rather heavy indictment, but would it be true to say that people who are conformists, who have no integrity, who flip-flop between situations as they see fit, aren't they just sort of a ticking time bomb waiting to betray you? The capacity of the betrayal can vary. Perhaps it's just making a joke at your expense, but perhaps it's something major like abandoning you in favour of one social situation over the other. They promise to come hang out with you at the beach, but in the face of being invited to a really cool party, they ditch you and go to the party instead. That's just something to consider. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. So to sort of wrap up many of my other notes that I've written, I did write down it was like when the substance took effect, it was like a crowd of people had left the room, and suddenly my internal monologue, sort of what I was thinking in my head, had come to the fore. We've always been in that situation when you've been in a loud, repetitive situation, like really loud music or something, and then someone turns it off, the silence just comes crashing down. And that's certainly what it felt like when this passion flower was taking effect. I did remark it was very useful for meditation. That is something I will be looking to do in the future. At the moment, I was preoccupied with sort of observing rather than enjoying, but also taking notes. Along with the alienation from my own body came a sort of reserved detachment and indifference to any actions I was performing. So as I got ready for bed and I brushed my teeth and that sort of thing, I sort of looked on with indifference, essentially. It was like watching, someone had just flicked a button and just left a machine running. And again, to touch upon labels just briefly, I described it as being back in the fray, because I went from being very still, looking at myself very intently, to suddenly I was sort of whipping back and forth, picking things up, brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed. I'm not entirely sure of the significance of back in the fray. You could extrapolate that quite widely and say, a lot of people, all they do all the time is just frantically scurry to and fro, gotta go to work, and then I gotta go do this, and I gotta do that, and they just don't take the time to sort of stop and sit with themselves. Oh yes, and the last thing to note, or the second last thing to note I should say, is a very strange thing that happened before I went to bed. I sort of tucked myself into bed, and as I went to turn on my alarm for the morning, I began to watch YouTube videos, and I began to listen to music. And essentially what I ended up doing, and this sounds incredibly strange, is I turned the flashlight on my phone and I began to cast finger puppets on the ceiling, and I basically anthropomized my fingers. They had like a personality within each song I listened to, and I sort of acted out each song with my little hand puppets, which was very, very strange. I don't really think there was much significance to it, rather than a sort of self-inflated one within the narratives of the stories. I listened to some Black Sabbath, maybe a bit of Queen. I can't actually remember. I could go back through my internet history and have a look. I definitely remember there being Black Sabbath, and that was very strange. I mean, that is not something that I would consider to be particularly enlightening. It seemed to be just hedonistic. I found it enormously entertaining. The last thing to note is actually rather interesting. So I could have stayed, longer on with the experience, but I was very interested in the fact that Passionflower can induce rather intense lucid dreaming. Now, I've always been a fairly lucid dreamer myself, especially after I play video games. Something seems to, flick inside me, and suddenly I'm much more able to control my dreams. I often have very vivid dreams, but what was very interesting with this experience is that I had a dream, but it was not very lucid at all. I barely recall anything about it. I do remember only the feeling of intensity of the dream, but there was no recall. I have no recall of the dream, and I had absolutely no control over it, which was very interesting because that was one of the common state of effects of Passionflower Incarnata, but perhaps that is something that is sort of built up over time, as people often consume a small amount of the plant every day, and maybe that's what you need to go to get this experience rather than just the single dose that I took. So essentially, that's that in a nutshell. Sort of loosely organized basic retelling of what occurred a few nights ago when I took upon this passionflower tea and waited to see what would happen. It was certainly a very interesting experience. I am going to try it again, but this time I'm going to be more sort of focused on the experience itself rather than, stopping to take down notes and that sort of thing, which broke the mold, so to speak. It distracted me from, the actual effects of the substance. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you have anything to remark upon or any questions or any relevant experience you've had, items of significance, or you'd like to discuss anything I brought up in this video, the sort of esoteric nature of symbols and meaning and that sort of thing, please let me know down in the comments. I'll be very interested to hear. Often when I speak to people about drugs, it's always in a hedonistic sense. So, I got so stoned and we ate so many chips and it was so fun. And that's fine and good, and if that's all you're after, but I'd be very interested to hear any sort of deeper meaning, any spirituality people have experienced on any mind-altering substance. And as always, thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.